There are sounds a town learns to live with. The groan of the river under the ice, the long iron sigh of the night train, and, above all of it, the steady voice of the great clock that stood atop the Pike textile mill, marking the hours over the rooftops of Ashford Mills as faithfully as a heartbeat. For 30 years, that clock had never been wrong. 12 strikes at noon, 12 at midnight, never one more, never one less. The people of that small Pennsylvania town set their lives by it, and they slept easier knowing it watched over them in the dark. So when the bell rang a 13th time on a still October night, every soul who heard it sat straight up in bed. It came just after midnight, when the cold had settled deep into the valley and the last lamp in the last window had gone dark. The first 12 strokes rolled out across the frost the way they always did, slow and certain, fading into the hills. And then, when the silence should have closed over the town like a lid, there came one more, a 13th stroke, deeper than the others, heavier. It did not ring so much as it pressed, as if the bell had been struck not by iron, but by something cold and patient that lived inside the tower. Dogs that had slept through every storm of their lives began to howl, low and broken, the way they howl at things people cannot see. A baby woke screaming 3 streets over and could not be soothed all night, no matter how its mother walked the floor. An old widow on Chapel Street rose and lit every candle she owned and sat among them until dawn, her lips moving in prayer. And in the boarding house near the mill gate, a man named Royce Dunn opened his eyes in the dark and felt his blood turn to river water. Royce Dunn was the mill foreman, and he was not a man easily frightened. He had broken strikes with an axe handle. He had pulled drowned men from the wheel pit without flinching. But he lay there now with the sweat going cold on his neck, counting the strokes again in his head, and the number would not change. 13. There was no 13. There had never been a 13. He told himself it was the cold. Metal did strange things in the cold. A gear could slip, a spring could catch, and an old machine could stumble over its own count, like an old man missing a step on the stairs. By morning, he had half convinced himself of it. So when the mill owner sent word that the clock wanted seeing to, Royce took his lantern and his bag of tools and climbed the long iron stair inside the tower, the way he had 100 times before. He was up there a long while, longer than the job should have taken. The men in the yard below heard no hammering, no scrape of a wrench, none of the ordinary noises of a man at work. Only silence. And then, once, a single sharp sound that might have been a cry and might have been the wind in the louvers. Nobody could say. The few men crossing the mill yard that gray morning would later swear to what they saw next, though no 2 of them told it quite the same. The tower door banged open, and Royce Dunn came down those stairs not like a man, but like something falling. His lantern was gone. His tool bag was gone. His face. They all agreed on this. His face was the white of candle wax, and his eyes were fixed on nothing, the way a drowning man stares at a shore he knows he will never reach. One of them caught his arm and asked what in God's name was the matter. Royce looked at him as though he had never seen a human face before. His mouth worked. No sound came out at first. Then he said one thing, in a voice scraped down to a whisper. "It's keeping a different time now." That was all. He pulled his arm free and kept walking, straight across the yard, straight out the gate, and he did not stop. He went to the boarding house, and he did not pack a trunk. He took the clothes on his back and a fistful of dollars from under his mattress, and before the noon whistle blew, he was on the southbound road out of Ashford Mills, with the collar of his coat turned up against a wind that was not there. He never came back. Not for his wages, not for the woman he had been courting, not for anything. A foreman who had bossed that mill for 11 years walked away from all of it because of something he had seen at the top of a clock tower. And to the end of his days, he would not say what it was. The town would have its theories. The town always did. But the truth of it ran deeper and older and far more terrible than gossip could reach. And to understand it, you would have to go back. Back before the 13th bell. Back before Royce Dunn ran. Back to the autumn the trouble began, when the mill still roared and the money still flowed, and a rich man still believed, as rich men so often do, that there was no debt in this world he could not refuse to pay. Back to the morning the locked door took the lives it took, and back, further still, to a quiet old man with steady hands who had built a clock to keep the time, never dreaming that one day it would learn to keep a score. To understand how a clock can come to hate, you must first understand the town that built it and the man who owned them both. Ashford Mills was not an old town, nor a gentle one. It had grown up fast and hard around a single great building of red brick and black iron that crouched on the riverbank like a sleeping animal breathing smoke. That building was the Pike Textile Mill, and from the first gray light of morning until long after the supper hour, it never truly went quiet. The looms inside it ran in their hundreds, row upon row, and the noise of them was a kind of weather that the whole valley lived under. Children were born to that sound and grew up never having known silence. The river that turned the great wheel ran the color of dye more days than not, red one week and a sickly green the next. And the fish had long since gone from it. Everything in Ashford Mills belonged to the mill, and the mill belonged to Cornelius Pike. He was a heavy man of perhaps 50 years, broad through the shoulders and going soft through the middle, with a wide, pale face and small eyes that moved quickly and missed nothing. He dressed in fine, dark wool and a watch chain of real gold that he liked to draw out and consult in front of poorer men, as though his time were made of costlier stuff than theirs. He had not been born rich. He had clawed his way up from the loom floor himself, and he never forgot it, and he never forgave anyone for reminding him of it. The men who worked for him said, quietly and only among themselves, that Cornelius Pike could hear a penny drop from across the county and feel $1 leave his pocket like a tooth pulled from his jaw. He owned the mill and the boarding houses where the workers slept and the company store where they spent the wages he paid them, so that much of the money he handed out with one hand came flowing back into the other before the week was through. He owned the church's mortgage and the mayor's gratitude. He believed, with the deep and tranquil certainty of a man who has never once been told no, that the whole town was simply an extension of himself, and that the people in it were a kind of machinery, to be run as hard as they would bear and replaced when they broke. There was only one thing in all of Ashford Mills that Cornelius Pike did not feel he fully owned, and it stood directly above his own head. The clock tower rose from the front of the mill, square and tall, its 4 white faces looking out over the town in all directions. Pike had commissioned it years before, in a season of pride, wanting the whole valley to see the hour by his mill and know who kept it. But he had not built the clock. He could not have. For that, he had needed the one man in the county whose hands could be trusted with such a thing. And that man was Abel Crane. Abel Crane was old, past 65, with a long, careful face and a fringe of white hair and eyes that had spent a lifetime looking at very small things in very good light. He had built clocks all his life, and watches before that, and he understood machinery the way a shepherd understands his flock, not as parts, but as living things with moods and needs. When he climbed up into the tower to tend the great clock, which he did faithfully every week, he spoke to it under his breath the way other men speak to a horse. He oiled its gears with his own hands and listened to its turning with his head tilted, and if anything in it ran the least bit wrong, He heard it long before it could be seen. He was not a rich man and had never wanted to be. He lived in 2 rooms behind his little shop on the square, and he asked little of the world beyond good work and quiet evenings. But Abel Crane had one thing in his life that he loved entirely, and that was the boy. The boy's name was Eli. He was 16 years old, a foundling Abel had taken in as a small child, and he could not speak. Some sickness in his infancy had taken the words from him before they ever came, and the town, in its kindness, had long ago decided he must be simple as well. They were wrong. There was nothing simple about Eli. He saw everything, remembered everything, and said all he needed to say with his hands and his quick dark eyes and the small notebook he carried everywhere, its pages filled with a careful, slanting script. Abel had taught him the trade, and the boy had a gift for it that outran even the old man's. To watch the 2 of them work side by side in the lamplight, the old hands and the young ones, moving over the same delicate wheels without a word passing between them, was to watch something close to love. It was Eli who first noticed the change in Pike that autumn. The boy missed nothing, and in the weeks after the fire, he saw how the mill owner had taken to standing in the yard at odd hours, his gold watch forgotten in his hand, staring up at the white face of the clock tower with an expression the boy had never seen on him before. It was not pride. It was something closer to a man watching a door he was sure he had locked and wondering why it would not stay shut. The fire had come 3 weeks before the night of the 13th bell, and the town had already agreed, in the way towns do, to remember it wrongly. It began on an ordinary evening shift in the carding room, where the air hung thick with cotton dust, fine as flour and twice as eager to burn. No one ever learned what first made the spark, a friction in a belt perhaps, or a careless match, or simply the patient bad luck that lives in every mill built of old timber and oil. What mattered was not how it started, but how fast it ran. In the space of a few breaths, a single bright thread of flame had become a wall, and the wall became a roof of fire, and the women working the night looms looked up to find the way out already turning gold. There were 41 of them on the floor that night, most of them young, some no more than girls. They did what people do. They ran for the doors, and the doors would not open. The great double doors at the south end of the floor, the nearest and widest way out, had been chained shut from the outside. This was no accident, and the women knew it at once, because they beat upon those doors with their fists and their shoulders and felt the chain hold fast against them, while the smoke came down like a falling ceiling. Cornelius Pike had ordered those doors locked during the night shift for months. He had lost bolts of finished cloth to what he called pilfering, women slipping a yard of muslin under their shawls on the way home, and he had decided that the surest way to stop a thief was to give her no door to leave by. A few dollars of cloth, that was the arithmetic of it. A few dollars of cloth weighed against 41 lives, and the scale in Pike's mind had not even trembled. The foreman, Royce Dunn, held the only key to that south chain, and Royce Dunn was not at the door. Some of the women found the smaller north stair and lived. Most did not. When the bucket lines finally broke the fire's back near dawn, and the men went in with wet cloths over their faces, they carried out what the night had left them, and the whole town stood in the cold and watched, and something in Ashford Mills went quiet that has never fully spoken since. 11 women died behind that locked door. The youngest was a girl named Hannah Boyd, who was 19 and engaged to be married in the spring, and who had worked the looms since she was 12 to help keep her mother and her small brothers fed. They found her with her hands still raised, her wedding savings sewn into the hem of her skirt, $3.40 that the fire had not been able to take from her. Her mother kept those scorched coins in a tin on the mantle for the rest of her life and could never bring herself to spend a penny of them. By the next morning, the story had already begun to change. Cornelius Pike was a careful man, and grief, he understood, was a thing that could be managed like any other expense if you moved quickly enough. He went among the families with his hat in his hand and sorrow on his wide, pale face. He spoke of a terrible accident, an act of God, a tragedy that no man could have foreseen or prevented. He paid for the funerals out of his own pocket and let it be known that he had done so. He gave each grieving family a small sum he called a gift, and made certain they understood it was a gift and not a debt he owed, for a debt could be claimed in a court of law, and a gift could not. The doors, he said, had never been chained. They had warped in the heat and stuck, as old doors will. Who could say otherwise? The fire had eaten the chain and the lock and the truth along with them. And the town, which lived in his houses and bought at his store and owed him for the very roofs over its heads, chose to believe him. It was easier. It was warmer. A man cannot eat justice, and winter was coming. But not everyone looked away. Abel Crane had been crossing the square late on the night of the fire, walking home from a sickbed call with his coat collar up against the cold when the first glow lit the windows of the mill. He had run toward it like everyone else, and in the chaos of that night, in the few terrible minutes before the bucket lines formed, the old clockmaker had come around the south side of the building where the locked doors were, and he had seen something there in the leaping firelight that the official story left no room for. He saw the chain. He saw it whole and sound and biting into the door handles exactly as a man's hands had set it. And he saw in that same glance more than one man moving in the smoke near the lock who should not have been there, and a thing passed between their hands in the dark that he could not name, but would never afterward forget. Abel Crane said nothing that night. He was an old man and careful, and he knew what he had seen was the kind of knowledge that could get a poor man killed. He went home, and he did not sleep, and in the gray hours he took out his small notebook and began, very quietly, to write down everything he could remember. He did not yet understand that he had just signed his own name to a debt, and that in this town, all debts came due. For a week after the fire, Abel Crane became a quieter man than usual. And Eli, who read his master the way other people read weather, knew that something was wrong long before he knew what it was. The old man went about his work as he always had. He wound the shop clocks and mended the watches the townsfolk brought him, and climbed the tower on his appointed day to tend the great machine. But in the evenings, when the lamp was lit and the boy bent over his bench, Abel would sit a long while with his notebook open and his pen unmoving, staring at nothing, the way a man stares into a well he is afraid to drop a stone down. Twice Eli looked up to find the old man watching him with a strange tenderness, as though memorizing his face. What Abel was doing in those quiet days was making certain. He was too old and too careful a man to ruin lives, even guilty ones, on the strength of a single glimpse by firelight. So he did what he had done all his life, with every uncertain mechanism that ever came to his bench. He took it apart, piece by piece, to see how it truly worked. He walked the burned south side of the mill in the gray afternoons when no one was watching, and among the wet ash and ruined brick, he found what he was looking for: the chain, or what the fire had left of it, a length of heavy links, fused and blackened, still threaded through the iron loops of the door handles where a man's hands had set it. The lock hung from it yet. Fire does not chain a door. Fire does not turn a key. Abel crouched there in the cold ruin with his old knees aching and understood, past any comfortable doubt that 11 women had been shut in to die so that no yard of muslin might walk out unpaid. He learned other things too, in the patient way of a man who fixes small machines and knows that the truth, like a fault in a movement, always leaves a trace. He learned that Royce Dunn had been seen near the south doors in the hour before the fire, though the foreman now swore he had been across the yard the whole night. He learned that the key to the south chain, which should have hung on its nail in the foreman's office, had gone missing the week of the fire and reappeared the week after, scrubbed bright. And he came to understand that the chaining of those doors had not been the careless cruelty of one greedy man acting alone. It had been arranged. It had been agreed. More than one pair of hands had turned away from those doors that night, and more than one mouth had been bought to keep the turning quiet. And there, in the cold arithmetic of what he had found, the old clockmaker came to the hardest hour of his long life. He could burn the notebook. He could go on winding clocks and mending watches and grow old and die in his 2 warm rooms with the boy beside him, and no one would ever know. He owed these dead women nothing. He had not locked the door. He was one frail old man against the richest man in the county. And Cornelius Pike crushed inconvenient men the way a boot crushes a beetle, without malice and without a second thought. But Abel Crane had spent his whole life in the company of honest machinery, of gears that turned only as they should, and hands that pointed only at the true hour. And something in him had grown straight as a plumb line and could not now learn to bend. He thought of Hannah Boyd with her wedding money sewn into her hem. He thought of the 11 beating on a door that would not open in the last dark minutes of their lives. He thought that a town which agreed to forget such a thing was a town that had quietly died, whatever its clocks still said, and that a man who let it forget had helped to bury it. He made his decision on a cold, clear night, alone. And when it was made, he felt strangely light, the way a man feels when he has at last set down a weight he has carried too far. He would not go to the law. The law in Ashford Mills wore Pike's gratitude like a collar. He would go to Pike himself. He would give the man one honest chance to do right, to confess what had been done and make true amends to the families, before Abel took what he knew to the county seat where Pike's name meant less. It was, perhaps, the mistake of a good man to believe that even a wicked one might still be reasoned with. But it was the kind of mistake that good men have always made, and it was of a piece with everything Abel Crane had ever been. He told no one. He did not tell the boy to keep him clear of it. But Eli, missing nothing, saw the old man tuck the notebook into his coat the next morning with a particular care, and saw the set of his shoulders as he crossed the square toward the mill office, and felt, without knowing why, a cold finger touch the back of his neck. Abel Crane went in to see Cornelius Pike with the truth folded over his heart, and he believed, God help him, that the truth would be enough. He found Pike alone behind his great desk, his gold watch open in his hand. The mill owner listened to the old man's quiet words without moving, his small eyes very still. And when Abel had finished, Pike did not shout, and he did not deny. He only smiled, slowly, and closed his watch with a soft click, and asked the clockmaker whether anyone else had seen what was written in that little book. It was the wrong question for an honest man to be asked, and Abel, too late, understood it. Abel Crane was given 3 days to live, though he did not know it, and Cornelius Pike used them well. The mill owner did not act in haste. Haste was for poorer men. He told Abel in that quiet office that he was a reasonable fellow and that the matter wanted thinking over, and that he would send for the clockmaker in a few days to discuss how amends might honestly be made. He said it so smoothly that even Abel, who had looked into the man's eyes and seen the cold thing waiting there, walked home half believing he had won. That was Pike's gift. He could make a lie feel like a door swinging open. But the moment the old man was gone, Pike sent for the two he trusted with the work that could not be spoken of. The first was Royce Dunn, the foreman, who had turned the key on the south doors and could be hanged for it as easily as his master, and who therefore had every reason to keep his master safe. The second was Pike's own son. Silas Pike was 25, lean where his father was heavy, with the same small, quick eyes and none of the patience behind them. He had been raised to inherit the mill and had learned its cruelties without ever earning its calluses, and there was in him a careless meanness that even his father found useful and privately despised. Silas had been there the night of the fire. It was Silas who had carried the key from the office to the foreman's waiting hand. A small errand, a boy's errand, and it had made him a murderer before he was old enough to fully understand the word. He had spent the weeks since pretending he had not, and the pretense had curdled in him into something that needed only a push to turn to violence. These three sat together late into the night, and between them, they decided the manner of an old man's death. It would happen in the tower. That was Pike's idea, and there was a black wit in it that pleased him. The clockmaker loved that machine above all things. Let it be the last thing he ever saw. They would send word that the great clock was running rough and wanted his hand, an ordinary summons that no one would think twice about, late on an evening when the mill stood empty. And once he had climbed up into that high, cold room alone, the rest would be quick. It happened on the third night, under a thin and freezing rain. Abel came when he was called, as he always did, climbing the long iron stair with his lantern and his bag of small, bright tools, his breath smoking in the dark. He did not hear them come up behind him over the steady churning of the gears. He turned, at the last, perhaps feeling that cold finger on his neck that the boy had felt 3 days before. He had time to see their faces in the lantern light. He had time to understand. And then the three of them were upon him, and the high room received the kind of sounds it had never been built to hold, and the great wheels turned on through it all without missing a single tooth, indifferent as the hour itself. When it was done, they stood breathing hard in the lamplight, and the problem of the body lay between them. It was Silas, white and shaking and trying to seem a man, who found the answer, and it was the cruelest answer of all. There was a space deep within the works, behind the largest of the gears, a hollow in the heart of the machine where the iron frame made a kind of iron coffin. No one ever went there but Abel himself. They forced the old clockmaker's body down into that narrow dark, among the turning wheels he had loved, and they closed the panel over him, and the machine swallowed its maker whole. But the old man was not yet entirely gone. There are accounts of such things, of a final spark of will outlasting the breath by a moment, and the three who were there would carry to their graves what they saw in that high room. As they forced him down, Abel Crane's hand came free one last time, and instead of clawing for life, it pressed flat and deliberate against the great brass gear beside his face, the way a man lays his palm upon a Bible to swear. His lips moved. No sound came that they could hear over the works, but Silas Pike, who was nearest, swore ever after that he read the shape of the words, and that what the dying man said was not a curse in any language of the church, but something far quieter and more terrible. Time, the old man told the machine. Keep my time. Then his hand fell, and in the same instant, though no living hand had touched it, the great gear beneath his cold palm turned backward. Only a single tooth, One slow, deliberate click against the whole weight and direction of the works, as though the machine had nodded. The three men did not speak of it. They went down out of the tower into the freezing rain, and they told themselves it was the wind, or the settling of an old mechanism, or their own frightened eyes. Pike sent word the next day that Abel Crane had taken his savings and left town in the night, an ungrateful old fool chasing some grievance, and the town believed that too. Only the boy did not believe it. And high in the dark above their heads, the clock that had always told the truth began, very patiently, to keep a different kind of time. Eli knew his master was dead the moment he woke to a cold stove and an empty bed. In all the years the boy had lived behind the little shop, Abel Crane had never once failed to rise first, to wake the fire and set the kettle and have the lamp lit by the time Eli came yawning to his bench. The old man's habits were as fixed as the movements he built. So when the boy woke that gray morning to find the back room dark and the ashes dead and his master's coat gone from its hook, he did not tell himself the comfortable things a grown man might have told himself. He knew, the way an animal knows, that something had broken in the order of the world. He ran first to the tower, though he could not have said why. The mill yard was just stirring, the early hands trudging in with their collars up and their breath hanging white in the air. And Eli pushed through them and found the tower door and climbed the long iron stair 2 steps at a time until his lungs burned and the cold iron rail bit at his palms. The high room was empty. The great clock churned on as it always had, and there was nothing to see. No lantern, no tool bag, no sign that any living soul had been there. And yet the boy stood in that cold turning room and felt the small hairs rise along his arms, and could not make himself go near the dark space behind the largest gear, though his eyes went to it again and again as if pulled. He came down, and he ran through the town, and this was when the boy first learned how alone the silent are. He went to the constable and pulled at the man's sleeve and made the shapes with his hands, the signs that Abel had taught him, and the constable only frowned and told him kindly to go home, that his master had gone off on business and would be back by and by. He went to the shopkeepers on the square and opened his notebook and wrote in his careful slanting hand, "He did not leave. Something has happened. Please." And they read it and shook their heads and pitied him, the poor mute boy who did not understand that old men sometimes wander off. He found Royce Dunn crossing the yard and seized his arm, and the foreman looked down at him with a face gone suddenly tight and pale, and shook him loose harder than he needed to, and walked quickly away. It was the foreman's face that told Eli the most. He had no words, but he had spent his whole life reading the faces of men who would not look at him directly, and he saw guilt in Royce Dunn the way another man might read it printed in a paper. The boy stood alone in the middle of the yard with his notebook open in his hands, and understood that the truth was known to some and buried by them, and that he was a child who could not speak, and no one would help him. So he watched, and he waited, because watching and waiting were the only things he had. And in the days that followed, the boy began to notice what the grown people, busy with their lives, had not yet let themselves notice. The clock was wrong, not greatly, not at first. A minute lost across a day, then gained back, the shadow of the great hands falling a little out of step with the sun. Eli, who had helped tend that machine since he was small, knew its true voice the way he knew his own heartbeat, and he heard the wrongness in it growing. The ticking, when he pressed his ear to the tower wall, no longer kept the even stride his master had set into it. It hurried, then dragged, then hurried again, like the breathing of a man in a troubled sleep. Once, at dusk, he saw the minute hand on the eastern face stop for the space of 3 breaths and then leap backward, just slightly, before going on. He looked around to see if anyone else had seen. The square was full of people hurrying home in the cold, and not one of them had looked up. The boy began to sleep poorly. He would lie on his cot in the dark behind the silent shop and listen to the town clock strike the hours, counting them without meaning to. The way you count a thing you are afraid will one day come out wrong. And on the 7th night after his master vanished, it did. It was past midnight, the town gone dark and still under a hard autumn frost. The great clock began to strike 12, and Eli lay listening as he always did, his eyes open in the dark. The strokes rolled out slow and certain across the rooftops. 10, 11, 12. And then the boy's whole body went rigid because the silence did not come. There was one more, a 13th stroke, deeper than the rest, falling into the frozen dark like a stone into a well with no bottom. Eli felt it more than heard it, felt it pass through the cot and the floor and the marrow of him, and he knew, with a certainty colder than the night, exactly whose voice was speaking in that bell. He sat up in the blackness, his heart slamming, and across the town, he was not entirely alone in his waking. In a fine house on the hill, Cornelius Pike had also come awake at the 13th stroke and was lying very still in his bed, telling himself it was a dream. But the dead keep better time than the living, and the counting had only just begun. After the night of the first 13th bell, the mill itself began to change, and the men who worked there felt it before any of them dared to say it aloud. It started with the cold. The tower had always been a chill place, high and drafty, but now the cold in it had a different quality, a stillness that pressed on the ears and made the lantern flame stand straight and small. Men sent up to oil the works came down rubbing their arms and would not go back without a second fellow for company. The grease they laid on the gears was found the next morning frozen white, though the autumn had not yet turned hard enough for that. And the machine, which Abel Crane had kept running sweet as a music box for 30 years, had developed a voice. That was the word the workers used among themselves. A voice. Not the honest tick and churn they all knew, but something underneath it. A low, groaning mutter that rose and fell as though the gears were turning words over and over in the dark. Stand beneath the tower at the right hour, in the right silence, and you could almost make them out. Almost. An old woman who took in the mill's washing said she had stood under it one evening and heard, plain as anything, a single word repeated, over and over, patient as a dripping tap. Time, she said it was saying. Only that. Time, time, time. No one ever made them out for certain, and no one tried for long. Then the hands began to move on their own. The first man to see it was a watchman named Orrin Vale, who had no part in any of the wickedness, and was only an honest fellow walking his round in the small hours. He swore that he had looked up at the northern face of the clock and watched the great minute hand sweep backward, smooth and deliberate, 3 full hours against its proper turning, and then jerk forward again to the true time as though nothing had happened. He told it the next morning over breakfast, and the other men laughed at him. But the laughter was thin, because each of them had felt the wrongness in his own way, and was glad only that it had chosen someone else to show itself to. Eli saw far more than any of them, and could tell no one. The boy had taken to haunting the mill yard, drawn there against his own fear, because the tower held the last of his master, and he could not stay away. He saw the hands move. He saw the frost bloom on the inside of the clock faces in shapes that were almost letters, and once, for the space of a breath, in the unmistakable slant of his master's own hand, he saw, on the stillest nights, a faint cold light moving behind the clock faces where no lantern could be. Once, at dusk, he watched a flock of starlings rise from the tower roof all at once, the way birds do when something has frightened them, and wheel away over the town and not come back. The pigeons that had nested in the louvers for years were simply gone. Animals knew. Animals had always known. It was only people who argued themselves out of believing their own eyes. And Cornelius Pike argued harder than anyone. He would not hear a word of it. When the mutterings reached him, as everything in his town eventually did, he gathered his foreman and his floor bosses and told them in a hard, flat voice that the next man caught spreading ghost stories about his clock would be turned out of his job and his company house before nightfall, and his family with him into the winter. It was a threat with teeth, and the talk went quiet, at least where Pike might hear it. But a thing does not stop being true because a rich man forbids it, and in the quiet, the fear only grew, the way water grows under ice. What no one knew, what only Eli had begun to guess, was that the clock was not haunting the town at large. It was choosing. It had a list, and it was working down it in an order known only to itself and the honest men, the watchmen, the boy, the women at their washing, were permitted to glimpse its edges only as a kind of warning, the way thunder gives warning of the bolt that has already been decided. The proof of it came on a gray afternoon, and it came to the worst of the lesser men. His name was Lemuel Ott, and he had been one of those bought to keep quiet about the south doors. He had not locked them himself, but he had carried Pike's money to two other men afterward and had sworn a false oath before the company that the doors were warped and never chained. He was a small, frightened, greedy man, and the weeks of guilt and the talk of the tower had worn him thin. That afternoon, he was crossing the yard with his eyes down when something made him look up at the eastern face of the great clock, and Lemuel Ott began to scream. He pointed at the clock face, at the round of glass behind which only the works should turn, and he screamed that there was a man in there. An old man, he shrieked. An old man's white face pressed flat against the inside of the glass, looking down at him, looking only at him, with eyes that knew his name. The others ran to him and looked up where he pointed and saw nothing but the clock, ticking, indifferent, and the cold afternoon sky behind it. But Lemuel Ott had seen what he had seen, and from that hour he was a marked man. And somewhere high above them all, a single brass tooth turned over with a soft and final click. Lemuel Ott did not sleep that night, nor the next, nor any night that the clock left him. After he saw the old man's face behind the glass, the small, frightened man came apart by degrees, the way a cheap watch comes apart, one piece working loose and then another until nothing holds. He stopped coming to the mill. He bolted himself into his rented room above the chandler's shop and stuffed rags into the gaps around the window and would not come out. And the few who climbed the stairs to coax him heard only his voice through the door, thin and pleading, swearing he could hear it ticking under the floor. For Lemuel Ott had begun to hear the clock everywhere. It was in the walls of his room. It was under his bed. It was inside the cup of water on his nightstand. And when he poured the water out, the ticking only grew louder. He pressed his hands over his ears, and the sound came from inside his own skull. The steady, patient tick of a great machine counting something down. And beneath it, always, that low, groaning voice turning over its single word. Time. Time. He had carried a rich man's money to buy other men's silence, and now silence was the one thing in all the world he could not have. On the third night, the ticking changed. It began to slow. Lemuel Ott lay rigid on his narrow bed in the dark, and listened to the great unseen clock in his head drag towards some appointed mark, each tick longer than the last, each space between them a little wider, the way the strokes of a man's heart lengthen and part at the very end. He understood, in the animal part of him that knew the truth his mouth had spent weeks denying, that when the ticking stopped, so would he. He began to pray. He had not prayed since he was a boy. He prayed to be given back the silence he had sold, and no answer came but the slowing of the tick, and the cold creeping up through the floorboards, and the smell, faint and growing, of machine oil where no machine was. He thought in those last hours of the money, of how little it had been when you set it against this. He had sold 11 women and an honest old man for a sum he could have carried in one pocket. And now the ledger had been opened again, and his own name stood at the top of the column, and the figure beside it was everything he had. The chandler found him in the morning. The door had to be broken in, for it was bolted from the inside, and the window too, every gap still stuffed with its rag. There was no way anyone could have come in, and no mark on the body to say that anyone had. Lemuel Ott lay on the floor beneath the window, his knees drawn up like a child's, his two hands clamped hard over his ears. His face, the chandler said, and would say no more for a long while. His face was the face of a man who had heard a sound that no living person was ever meant to hear, but it was the watch that emptied the room of every man who saw it. Lemuel Ott had owned a cheap pocket watch, a tin thing he had carried for years and was forever winding. They found it open in his stiff right hand, clutched so tightly they had to work the cold fingers loose one by one. And when at last it came free and they turned its face to the gray morning light, every man in that room went still. The watch had stopped. The little hands stood frozen, and they did not point to any hour that a watch should be able to show. They had gone past the 12 at the top of the dial, and on into a place on the face where no number was marked, where no number could be. And there they had stopped, the two hands together, pointing at the empty space beyond the last hour. A 13th hour, the hour that does not exist. The chandler dropped the watch as if it had burned him, and it struck the floor and sprang open. And the men swore that for just a moment, before it lay still, the little hands had begun to move again, slow and backward, the way the great clock's hands had moved on the tower in the dark. After that, there was no more pretending in Ashford Mills. The talk Pike had forbidden came roaring back, too loud now for any threat to silence. For a man had died behind a bolted door with his pocket watch pointing at an impossible hour, and no rich man's word could explain that away. The town began to remember things it had agreed to forget. The fire, the 11 women, the youngest of them, Hannah Boyd, with her wedding money sewn into her hem. The old clockmaker who had not, after all, been the sort to run off in the night and leave the boy he loved behind without a word. People began to do sums in the dark, and the sums all came to the same dreadful figure. And in his fine house on the hill, Cornelius Pike heard of the watch and the impossible hour, and for the first time since the night in the tower, a thin, cold thread of fear worked its way into him. He told himself, still, that it was nonsense. A weak man frightened to death by his own guilt and a watch knocked askew in his death throes. He told himself this firmly and almost believed it. But that night, alone in his study, Cornelius Pike found himself drawing out his own fine gold watch, the one he loved to consult before poorer men, and holding it to the lamp, and checking, with a care he did not like to admit to, that its hands still pointed where they should. In the days after Lemuel Ott died behind his bolted door, the town drew its frightened breath and waited. And Cornelius Pike did the only thing a man like him knew how to do. He fought back the way he fought everything, with money and with menace. He called it madness, loudly and often. He stood on the steps of the company store and told the gathered townsfolk that a clock was brass and iron and nothing more, that Ott had been a drunkard worn out by his own nerves, that the talk of impossible hours was the invention of idle women and frightened fools. He raised wages a few cents on the floor, a thing he had never done, and the gesture frightened people more than it soothed them, for they had never known Pike to open his hand unless something had badly shaken him. And he watched his son, who was unraveling. Silas Pike had not been the same since the night in the tower. The careless meanness had gone out of him and left only the fear behind it, raw and constant. He drank now from the morning on. He startled at the striking of any clock and could not be in a room with one. He had begun to look at his father across the supper table with a terrible question in his eyes. The question of a young man who has done a thing he cannot undo and has only now understood that no amount of his father's money can buy it back. Cornelius told him to be a man, to hold his tongue and keep his nerve, and Silas held his tongue, but his hands shook, and the clock, high above the town, went patiently on with its counting. Through all of this moved the boy, and the boy alone understood what was truly happening. Eli had known from the first morning that his master was dead. Now, watching the men around the mill, he was learning a harder thing, which was who had killed him. He saw how Royce Dunn had fled. He saw how Silas Pike could not bear the sound of a clock. He saw how Cornelius grew louder in his denials as the fear in his eyes grew brighter. The boy could not speak, but he could read men, and these men were a confession written in plain hands for anyone with the eyes to see. He tried once more to make someone listen. He went to the new minister, a young man lately come to the town who did not yet wear Pike's collar, and he laid his notebook open on the man's table and wrote, page after careful page, all that he knew and all that he guessed. The minister read it gravely and was kind, and told the boy that grief plays tricks, and that he must pray and trust in God's justice rather than chase phantoms that could only bring harm to a poor, mute orphan with no one in the world to protect him. It was meant gently. It landed like a door closing. It was Cornelius Pike who made the boy stop trying. Pike came to the little clock shop himself one gray evening and found Eli alone at the workbench among his dead master's tools. The mill owner did not raise his voice. He stood in the small lamplit room, filling it, and he looked down at the boy with his small, still eyes, and he spoke very softly. He said it was a sad thing, a boy left all alone, with no master and no family, and no roof but the one a generous man might choose to let him keep. He said the world was hard on those who had no one, and harder still on those who told stories that troubled their betters. He said he hoped the boy understood him. Then he picked up one of Abel Crane's fine small chisels from the bench, turned it once in the lamplight, set it down, and left. Eli sat a long time in the dark after the door closed. He was 16 and alone, and the one man who had ever loved him was gone, and the men who had killed him owned the whole of his small world. He wept then, silently, the way he did everything, his shoulders shaking over the bench where Abel's tools lay in their patient rows. But grief in some hearts does not break. It sets, like a thing cooling in a mold, into something harder. When the boy had wept himself empty, he wiped his face and lit the lamp and did the thing his master would have done. He began quietly to investigate. He knew the tower. He had climbed it 100 times at Abel's side, and in the long nights that followed, he went back to it, alone, with a candle and the courage of the desperate, and he searched the high, cold room where his master had been called the night he vanished. He found the things the three killers in their haste had missed: a button, torn from the old man's coat, ground into the grease at the foot of the largest gear, a dark stain, long dried, in a place where no oil should fall. And when he crept close at last to the panel behind the great wheel, the panel his every instinct had warned him from since the first morning, he found the faint and dreadful smell that the cold had almost, but not quite, held down. Eli stood before that closed iron panel with his candle trembling in his hand, and he knew, past any doubt, what waited on the other side of it. He had found his master. He had found where they had hidden him, in the very heart of the clock he had built and loved. And high above the boy's bent head, in the dark, the great machine seemed to lean toward him, and its ticking, for one long moment, sounded almost like a sigh of relief. There were 4 men who had truly damned themselves over the body of Abel Crane, and the town knew only 3 of them. It knew of Cornelius Pike, who had ordered the locking of the doors and the silencing of the old man. It had come to suspect Royce Dunn, who had fled. And it whispered, now, of young Silas, who drank and shook and would not sit near a clock. 3 guilty men, and a town that thought it had the shape of the thing at last. But the boy, who had no words and so spent all his thought on watching, had begun to see that the shape was wrong. There was a 4th shadow in it, and when at last he understood whose it was, even Eli, who feared almost nothing now, felt the ground tilt beneath him. It was the constable. Harlan Webb had worn the town's badge for 20 years, and there was not a soul in Ashford Mills who would have named him among the wicked. He was a heavy, slow, kindly-seeming man who had bounced their children on his knee and broken up their tavern fights with a fatherly hand. When Abel Crane vanished, it was Harlan Webb who had patted the mute boy's shoulder and sent him home and declared, in his calm, official voice, that the old man had wandered off on business. The town had trusted that voice. That was the whole purpose of it, for Harlan Webb had been Pike's man for years, quietly, in the way that costs a town the most. It was Webb who had ruled the fire and accident without ever truly looking at the doors. It was Webb who had taken Pike's money, more than any of the others, to write in his official ledger that there had been no chain, no key, no crime. He had a daughter at a fine school in the city, and a comfortable house, and a future. And all of it had been bought with the same coin, paid out of the same hand, over the same buried truths. He had told himself, year by year, that he only smoothed things over, that he had never harmed a living soul, that a wise man takes the world as he finds it. And it was Webb, the boy came to understand, who had stood the 4th man in the tower that night, not to lift the knife, but to stand at the foot of the stair and make certain no one came, and afterward to see that no question was ever asked. The thing Abel had glimpsed passing between hands in the firelight had been a fold of Pike's money, going into the palm that wore the law's own badge. This was the cruelest truth of all, and the boy understood at once why the clock had let him find it. For so long as Harlan Webb wore that badge and spoke in that calm voice, there was no justice to be had in Ashford Mills by any honest road. The law itself had been bought. A man might go to the constable with the truth, as Eli nearly had, and the constable would nod and soothe and quietly see the truth buried with whoever carried it. The door the town thought stood open to it had been locked all along, chained from the outside, exactly as the south doors of the mill had been. And the moment the boy understood it, so, it seemed, did the clock. That night, the great bell tolled 13, and this time, the whole of Ashford Mills heard it. It was not as it had been before. a thing felt by one waking soul and doubted in the morning. The 13th stroke fell across the rooftops, and every man, woman, and child in the valley heard it and sat up in the dark and knew that the others had heard it too. Lamps bloomed in window after window. Out in the night, people found their way to their doorsteps and stood in the frost in their night clothes, looking toward the dark shape of the tower against the stars. And not one of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say that the bell had not already said for them. Mothers held their children closer. Old men crossed themselves. The reckoning was no longer a rumor. It had announced itself to the whole town at once, in a voice of iron, and named the hour that does not exist. In his house on the hill, Cornelius Pike stood at his window and counted the strokes against his will. And at the 13th, his hand closed so hard on the gold watch in his pocket that the case cracked. And down in the town, Harlan Webb, constable of Ashford Mills, woke at the 13th bell to find his bedroom very cold, and the smell of machine oil thick in the air, and his own service revolver, which he kept loaded on the nightstand, slowly turning in a circle on the wood, all on its own, its barrel coming round to point at the bed where he lay. He did not sleep again that night. None of the guilty did, for the clock had widened its eye to take in the whole town, and the message in that great shared toll was plain to every soul who had a part in the silence. It knew them all. It had always known them all, and it was no longer content to take them one by quiet one. The counting had become a summons. And somewhere on a southbound road, far from Ashford Mills, a man who believed he had run far enough was about to learn that there was no distance in the world that time could not cross. Royce Dunn had run a long way, and for a while, he had let himself believe it was far enough. He had come down out of the hills 3 weeks before, on the morning after the first 13th bell, with the clothes on his back and the money from under his mattress, and he had not looked behind him once. He took work where he could find it, a few days here loading freight, a week there mending fence, always moving south, always toward the warmer country where a man might lose himself among strangers. He grew a beard. He gave a false name in every town. He drank to sleep. He kept no clock and no watch and tore the pages from any calendar he found, as though he might escape the reckoning by refusing to mark the days. And in time, the shaking eased a little, and he began to tell himself the worst was behind him, that whatever he had seen at the top of that tower had been a sickness of his own mind, a fever cooked up by a guilty conscience, and that he had outrun it the way he had outrun every other trouble in his hard life. He was wrong. You cannot outrun time. Time is already waiting at the end of every road a man can take. It found him in a railway town 3 counties south, in a cheap rented room over a saloon, on a night when the first hard snow of the year came down silent and heavy outside his window. Royce Dunn woke in the small hours to a cold he knew. Not the honest cold of winter, but the still, pressing cold of that high room in the tower, the cold that made the lamp flame stand straight and small. And in the dark of that strange rented room, 3 counties from his crime, he heard it, ticking. It came up through the floor, slow and patient and enormous, the tick of a machine far larger than any that could fit in such a place. And Royce Dunn lay rigid in his bed, with the sweat freezing on him, and knew that it had found him after all. He had locked his door. He got up in the dark and checked it again, and checked the window, and stuffed the gaps with his coat, the way poor doomed Lemuel Ott had done, though he could not have known it. None of it mattered. The ticking was not outside. It was beneath. It was within. It was the sound of his own borrowed time running out. He lit every lamp in the room and sat in the corner with his back to the wall and waited for the dawn that he somehow knew would not save him. In the deepest part of the night, the ticking began to slow, and as it slowed, Royce Dunn saw the hands. There were no clocks in that bare little room, and yet upon the far wall, in the wavering lamplight, two long shadows had appeared, the shadows of a great clock's hands, and they were moving, sweeping slowly backward across the wall, across the peeling paper, across the cold floor, toward the corner where he sat. He watched them come. He could not move. He understood in those last moments that they were sweeping back through time itself, back and back, to the 1 hour he had spent the rest of his life trying to flee. The hour at the foot of the tower stair when he had stood guard over the murder of an honest old man for the price of his own worthless safety. The shadow hands reached the corner where he sat. They closed over him like the blades of a great dark scissor. And the saloon keeper, coming up in the morning to see why his tenant had not stirred, found the door bolted from the inside and had to break it down. Royce Dunn sat in the corner, his back to the wall, his eyes open. There was not a mark upon him, but his face was the white of candle wax, frozen in the same stare the men in the mill yard had seen as he fled. And his old pocket watch lay open in his lap, its hands stopped together at the hour that does not exist. The news of it came back to Ashford Mills slowly, the way such news does, carried by a traveling drummer who had heard the railway town talking. A mill foreman who had run off in the autumn found dead of fright in a locked room with his watch stopped wrong. The town heard it and went very quiet, and made the same dreadful sum it had made over Lemuel Ott, and the sum came out larger now and plainer, for here was the lesson the clock had wished the whole valley to learn. It did not matter how far a guilty man ran. It did not matter how many counties or how many years he put between himself and the thing he had done, nor how many false names he wore, nor how many calendars he burned. The debt did not stay behind in Ashford Mills. The debt traveled with him, patient as a shadow, certain as the hour, and it would find him in the end in whatever dark corner he had crawled to, and it would collect in full. 2 of the 4 were gone now, and in his great house on the hill, Cornelius Pike, who had told himself he could buy or bully his way clear of anything, sat alone before a cold hearth and understood at last that this was the one creditor in all his life he could neither pay, nor frighten, nor outrun. His son was next, and the father knew it. Whatever else might be said of Cornelius Pike, and there was a great deal, he loved his son. It was the one soft place in a hard man, the single account on which he had never kept a careful ledger. Everything Pike had clawed and cheated and killed to build, he had built for Silas, so that the boy might stand one day where his father had stood and never know the loom floor or the hungry years. He had not been a tender father, for he did not know how. But every cold and grasping thing he had done in this world, he had done with the boy in the back of his mind, telling himself it was for the boy. And now the clock that he could not buy or threaten was reaching for that one soft place. And for the first time in his life, Cornelius Pike was afraid in the way that poor men are afraid, helplessly, with nothing in his hands and no one to pay and no one to threaten. The signs had begun. Silas could no longer sleep at all. He sat up through the nights with a bottle and a lamp turned high, and still the cold would come into his room, and the smell of oil. And once, his father found him at dawn crouched in the corner with his hands over his ears, whispering that the ticking was inside the walls, that it was counting, that it was almost done counting. The same unraveling that had taken Lemuel Ott was taking Silas now. day by day, and Pike could only watch it and rage. So he did what men like him always do at the last. Having failed to buy the thing and failed to frighten it, he resolved to destroy it. If the curse lived in the clock, then he would tear the clock apart. He would pull down the gears and melt the brass and break the great machine into pieces too small to hold a ghost, and let his enemies whisper what they liked. He told no one his full intent. He simply let it be known that the tower clock was to be dismantled for repairs, and he gathered the few men still desperate enough for his wages to do the work. And on a gray afternoon with the light already failing, Cornelius Pike climbed the long iron stair into the tower for the first time since the night he had helped murder its keeper. The cold met him at the top like a hand against his chest. The high room was as it had always been, the four pale faces glowing dimly with the last of the day, the great wheels turning. But the air in it was wrong, thick and still and freezing, and the men who had come up behind him grew quiet and would not go far from the stairhead. Pike made himself cross to the heart of the machine. He made himself take up the heavy iron bar he had brought, and he set its edge against the teeth of the great brass gear, the very gear upon which a dying man had laid his hand and made his promise. And he threw his whole weight upon it to wrench the works apart. The bar would not move. The gear, which a child could have turned with one finger when the clock was being built, stood against the full strength of a grown man, as though it were not brass at all, but the bedrock of the hill itself. Pike strained until the blood roared in his ears and the muscles of his back screamed and his fine coat split along the seam, and the gear did not give by the breadth of a hair. He cursed it. He called for the men to bring their weight to the bar beside him, and not one of them would cross that freezing room to touch it. And then it moved on its own, slowly, against all the weight he was throwing against it. The great gear began to turn backward, and the iron bar in Pike's hands turned with it and dragged him forward, and he had to let go and stumble back or be pulled into the works. The whole machine had come alive. Every wheel in that high room was turning now, faster and faster, in directions no clockwork should run, and the four hands on the four faces spun wild and backward, and the groaning voice rose up out of the gears until it filled the tower. And this time, there was no mistaking the single word it spoke: time. The men at the stairhead broke and fled, tumbling down the iron stair in the dark. Pike backed away from the shrieking machine with his arms raised against it, and as he reached the head of the stair, the great bell above him gave a single, deafening stroke, though it was nowhere near the hour. One tremendous toll that knocked him to his knees and rang in his skull like the end of the world. When the echo died, the clock was still again. Quiet, turning sweetly, truly, showing the correct and ordinary hour, as innocent as it had ever been. Cornelius Pike crawled to the stair and went down it on unsteady legs, and he did not try to break the clock again. He understood now that it could not be broken, that it would suffer no hand to stop it before its work was done. He had come to destroy it, and it had let him see for one moment exactly how small he was before it. He went home through the early dark to sit beside his sleepless, doomed son, the two of them waiting together in the great cold house for an hour that had not yet come, but that was coming as surely as the next turn of a wheel. The clock gave up its secret on the coldest morning of that year, and it was the boy who brought the town to see it. Eli had carried his terrible knowledge alone for many days. He knew where his master lay. He had stood before the iron panel in the dark and smelled the truth behind it. But he was one mute orphan, and the law in Ashford Mills wore Pike's badge, and he had learned the hard way that no grown man would believe the writing in his little book. So he had waited, the way his master had taught him to wait on a delicate repair, for the one moment when the thing would come right in his hands. That moment came after Pike's failure in the tower. The story of it had run through the town like fire through dry cotton. The mill owner driven to his knees by his own clock, the men fleeing down the stair. For the first time, the people of Ashford Mills were more afraid of the truth they had buried than of the man who had paid them to bury it. And the boy, watching with his patient dark eyes, saw that the moment had come at last. He did not go to the constable. He went to the people.
On that bitter morning, he moved through the town with his notebook, and he did not write his pleas this time. He simply took people by the sleeve, the washerwoman and the chandler and the young minister and the families of the 11 dead girls, and he drew them after him toward the mill, gathering them as he went, until a silent crowd, 100 strong, stood in the frozen yard beneath the 4 pale faces of the clock. Then the boy went to the tower door and opened it, and looked back at them, and something in his face made even the doubters follow him up the long iron stair into the cold. They crowded into the high turning room, their breath smoking, and Eli led them to the heart of the machine, to the iron panel behind the great gear, the panel no one but Abel Crane had ever opened. The boy set his small hands upon it, and here a strange thing happened, a thing the 100 of them would swear to ever after. The great machine, which had fought a grown man's iron bar to a standstill only days before, went quiet and still as the boy touched it, the gears slowing, the ticking gentling, as though it knew his hands, as though it had been waiting all this while for these particular hands to come. The panel opened easily for Eli, and the clock gave its keeper back to the light. What they found there silenced the whole crowd, and more than one strong man turned away and could not look. Abel Crane lay folded into the iron hollow where his murderers had forced him, among the wheels he had loved, and the deep cold of the tower had kept him through all the weeks, so that he was terribly, mercifully recognizable still. One frail old hand still rested against the great brass gear, palm flat, the way a man lays his hand upon a Bible to swear, exactly where he had laid it in his dying moment, as though he had never once taken it away in all the weeks of his counting. There was no more talk of an old man wandering off on business. There was no more story that any rich man's money could buy. The truth lay before them in the frozen dark, plain as an hour on a dial, and the town that had agreed to look away was made at last to look. The young minister knelt and wept and began to pray aloud. The washerwoman who had heard the clock saying time beneath the tower covered her face, and the mothers of the 11 dead girls stood looking down at the murdered old man. And in their grief there kindled something harder, for they understood now beyond any doubt that the fire had been no accident, that their daughters had been locked in to die, and that the same hands had done both wickednesses and the same money had hidden them. Word of it reached Cornelius Pike within the hour, and this time there was nothing he could do. He could not call it madness, for 100 witnesses had seen the body with their own eyes. He could not buy their silence, for grief and horror had risen past the reach of his money. He could not send the constable to bury it, for the constable's own guilt was now part of the tale. And Harlan Webb had locked himself in his house and would not come out. In the space of a single morning, the whole carefully built world of Cornelius Pike, the world of a man who had believed there was no debt he could not refuse to pay, simply came apart in his hands. The town did not come for him with ropes and torches. It did something worse. It turned its back. Doors that had always opened to his money closed against him. The men who had bowed would not meet his eye. The shop girls at his own company store fell silent when he entered and would not serve him. He walked through Ashford Mills that afternoon and found himself, for the first time in his life, utterly alone in the town he owned. A rich man with no one left who would take his hand or his coin. A king whose kingdom had quietly decided he was already a ghost. And high above him, the clock, having shown the town its dead, resumed its patient, ordinary ticking. Its work in the daylight was done. It had only one piece of business left, and that business was upstairs in the great, cold house on the hill, sitting sleepless by a lamp, with his hands over his ears, listening to the counting come to its end. The hour of the sun came on the night after the town turned its back, and it came as all the reckonings had come, in a shape cut to fit the crime. Silas Pike had not left the great house in days. He kept to a single upstairs room, the lamps burning, the bottle never far, and his father kept the watch with him. The two of them sitting in that cold, bright room while the rest of the house stood dark and empty around them. The servants had all gone. Even they would no longer stay beneath that roof. Father and son were alone with each other and with the thing that was coming, and there was little left to say between them. Cornelius had no comfort to give that was not a lie, and Silas was past being lied to. He sat with his knees drawn up and his hands often at his ears, and he listened to the ticking that only he could hear. And he counted under his breath the hours that were left to him. He had been only a boy in his way when it began. He had carried a key from an office to a waiting hand, a small errand, and told himself it meant nothing. He had stood in the tower and helped force an old man down among the gears, and told himself he'd had no choice. All his short life he had told himself that the things he did were not really his doing, that he was only his father's son, carried along on a current he had not made. Now, in the last of his hours, the lies had worn through, and the boy beneath them was left to face alone what the man had done. Once, near the end, he turned to his father in the lamplight and said, in a voice gone small and very young, that he was sorry, that he wished he had run for the door himself and torn the chain off with his own hands. His father had no answer for him. There is no answer a father can give to that when it comes too late. It was near midnight when the cold came into the room. Both of them felt it, but it was Silas the ticking gathered around, rising up out of the walls and the floor until the very air seemed to throb with it. The lamp flame stood straight and small. The smell of machine oil filled the room, and Silas Pike rose from his chair, not of his own will, his eyes wide and fixed on something in the doorway that his father, straining, could not see. Cornelius saw only his son. He saw Silas walk to the door as though led by the hand, out into the dark hall, down the great cold stair, and the father followed, pleading, clutching at him, and his hands closed on nothing, for the boy moved through his grip like water. Silas went out the front door into the freezing night in his shirt sleeves, and down the hill toward the town and toward the mill, and his father stumbled after him through the snow, weeping now, calling the boy's name into a silence that swallowed it whole. They came to the mill. The great south doors stood before them in the dark, the doors that had been chained on the night of the fire, rebuilt now, but the same doors in the same wall. And as Silas reached them, they swung open of their own accord upon the black and empty mill floor, and a warmth breathed out of that darkness, and a glow, the first deep red glow of a fire that was not there. Silas Pike walked toward it. His father screamed and threw himself forward and was held back by what he never knew, an iron stillness in the air that he could not break, so that he could only stand at the threshold and watch his son walk into the dark of that empty mill. The great doors swung shut, and from behind them, in the place where no fire burned, Cornelius heard his son begin to scream, and beneath the screaming, the beating of many fists upon the inside of a door that would not open, the sound of 11 women dying that the boy was made to hear and feel as they had felt it, alone in the dark, behind a door he had helped to lock.
When the doors opened again at last, the screaming had stopped. They found Silas Pike on the cold floor of the empty mill in the morning, unburned, unmarked, his hands raised before his face, his eyes wide upon a fire that no one else would ever see. And clutched in his hand was the south door key, the very key he had carried on the night of the fire, the key that had been lost and scrubbed and lost again, returned now to the palm that had first betrayed it. Cornelius Pike was found kneeling in the snow outside the doors, where he had knelt all night, and he was never, from that hour, entirely a man again. The clock had not taken his life. It had taken the one thing he had built his whole black life around, the one soft place, the son for whom every cruelty had been a gift. It had left the father alive to understand exactly what his greed had purchased, and exactly who had paid. 3 of the 4 were gone, and the last of them knelt alone in the snow, with nothing left in all the world to lose. And far above him, the great clock began slowly to strike the hour. When the great clock began to strike, Cornelius Pike rose from the snow where he had knelt all night, and he did a thing that surprised even himself. He did not run. There was nowhere left to run. He understood that now, as Royce Dunn had learned it in his locked room 3 counties south. There was no door in all the world that this creditor could not open, no distance it could not cross, no price that would turn it from its purpose. And there was, besides, no longer anything in Cornelius Pike worth saving. His son was dead on the floor of the mill behind him. His name was Ash. The town had turned its back. The whole of the cold empire he had built, the mill and the houses and the store and the church's mortgage and the mayor's gratitude, every brick of it bought with other men's lives, was rubble in his hands and meant exactly nothing. And he saw at last that it had always meant nothing. He was an old man alone in the snow, with the strokes of his own clock falling around him like blows. So he went to it. He walked through the dark and silent mill, past the place where his son lay, and he climbed the long iron stair into the tower for the last time, to face the thing he had made. The high room was waiting for him. It was colder than it had ever been, cold past the power of any winter, and the 4 pale faces glowed with a light that did not come from the dawn, for the dawn had not yet come. The great wheels were still. For the first time in 30 years, the clock was not turning, and the silence of its stopping was the most terrible sound Cornelius had ever heard. And in the heart of that stillness, beside the open iron panel where his murdered keeper had lain, stood Abel Crane. Not the broken thing they had drawn out into the light. The old man as he had been in life, slight and white-haired, his careful face turned toward the man who had killed him, his eyes holding no rage at all, which was worse than any rage could have been. Cornelius Pike, who had not wept since he was a child, who had locked 11 women behind a door and felt the scale in his mind not tremble, stood before the quiet ghost of the old clockmaker and felt every buried thing in him break open at once. He saw it all. The clock made him see it. He saw the women at the doors, their fists, their faces in the smoke. He saw Hannah Boyd with her wedding savings in her hem. He saw Abel climb the stair with his lantern, trusting, and the 3 of them come out of the dark. He saw his own son carried off screaming into a fire that was not there. Every hour he had stolen, every life he had spent to fatten his own, the clock gave them all back to him at once, in a single, unbearable moment, and made him stand inside them and feel their full and final weight.
Abel Crane looked down at the kneeling man, and the old ghost's face held something almost like sorrow. He raised one frail hand, not to strike, but as a man lifts his hand in farewell. And he spoke, or the clock spoke through him, in a voice that was the low groan of the gears and the toll of the bell and the whisper of a dying old man all at once. "You wanted more time," it said. "You took it from the living to keep for yourself. So keep it now. Keep all of it. Every hour you stole, you will hear, and you will not die, and you will not forget." Then the old man was gone, as a candle goes out, and the great clock struck its final stroke. The 13th bell, vast and deep and final, tolled out over Ashford Mills one last time, and Cornelius Pike, alone in the freezing tower, threw back his head and answered it with a scream that the whole waking town would hear and never afterward forget. When the stroke had died away, the clock fell silent, truly silent. The endless ticking that had filled the tower for 30 years simply stopped and did not start again. The great wheels stood frozen at an hour past 13, the hour that does not exist. And there they would stay. And in that silence, kneeling in the dark of the dead machine, Cornelius Pike began, very quietly, to laugh, and then to weep, and then to do both at once. His hands pressed hard over his ears against the ticking that no one else would ever hear, but that he would hear now for the rest of his natural life. The counting was over. The debt was paid in full. And the worst of it, for the man who had thought no debt could ever touch him, was only now beginning. They found Cornelius Pike in the tower the next morning, and the man they found was not the man who had climbed the stair. The town had heard his scream in the dark, and when the gray light came, a few of the braver men went up at last, expecting to bring down a corpse, for they thought no living throat could have made that sound. Instead, they found him kneeling on the floor of the dead machine, his eyes open and his hands clamped over his ears, rocking a little and smiling. He did not seem to see them. When they touched his shoulder, he turned that smile up to them, mild and dreadful, and asked in a pleasant conversational voice whether they too could hear the time, the lovely time ticking away so beautifully, and whether they did not agree that there was a great deal of it, more than a man could ever count. Cornelius Pike had gone mad in the night, and he never came back. There was no wife to grieve for him or care for him. Pike had buried her years before, a quiet woman, worn out young in the building of his fortune, and he had scarcely marked her passing at the time, for she had given him his son and so served what he took to be her purpose. Now there was no one. The servants would not return. The town that had feared him would not nurse him. In the end, it was the young minister who owed him nothing and forgave him nothing, but pitied him as Christ had taught, who saw the broken man taken to the county asylum 2 valleys over and signed the paper and paid the small fee out of the church's poor box, which was a charity Cornelius Pike had never once in his life troubled to fill. He lived a long time there. That was the cruelty of it, and the justice of it. He was not an old man when they took him, and his body, which had never wanted for anything, was strong. He lived on in that gray place for many years, long after the mill had closed and the town had begun to empty, long after most of those who remembered his crimes had themselves gone into the ground. The fortune he had killed to build was spent, in the end, on his own long keeping in that place, dollar by dollar, until the last of it was gone, and he was kept on charity like any pauper, which was perhaps the final small joke of the clock. And in all those years, he was never once free of the ticking. The attendants would find him in the small hours, sitting up in his cot with his hands over his ears, counting under his breath, his lips moving over numbers that climbed past 12 and into a country of hours that have no names. He was forever listening to a clock that no one else could hear, the great clock of his guilt, striking out the stolen hours one by one. And there were more of them, far more than any man could bear to count. And he was made to count them all. Abel. The name was Abel. And then, softer still, I'm sorry. As though after all the stolen years, some small last human thing in the ruin of Cornelius Pike had finally understood what it had done. It was, in the end, exactly the sentence the old clockmaker had spoken. Pike had wanted more time, and time he was given, an ocean of it. Every hour he had ever stolen returned to him to hear and to suffer, and never to escape. He did not die for his crimes. Dying would have been a release, a door swinging open, and the clock had judged that a door swinging open was a mercy he had not earned. He was left instead to live and to listen and to know. There are those who will say this was too hard a fate, even for such a man. And there are those, the mothers of 11 daughters chief among them, who went to their graves believing it was not nearly hard enough. The story does not take a side. It only sets the thing down as it happened, and lets each who hears it weigh the scale for himself, as Cornelius Pike once weighed 11 lives against a few yards of cloth, and found, too late, that the scales of this world are truer than he ever dreamed, and that they always, always balance in the end. So passed the master of Ashford Mills, who had thought himself the owner of every hour in his valley, and learned at the last that he had only ever been borrowing them, and that the lender had come, as lenders do, to be repaid. But the story does not end with the guilty. It never does. For in every reckoning there is one the clock does not call, one who walks out of the dark untouched. And to understand why, we must turn at last to the boy who could not speak, and the one mercy in all this long, cold tale. The clock had called 4 men by name, and it had let one boy walk untouched through the whole of its long reckoning. The town wondered at that for years afterward, and never quite agreed on the reason, but the boy himself understood it, in the wordless way he understood most things, and it was very simple. The clock had no quarrel with the innocent, for all its terror, for all the cold and the impossible hours and the dead behind their locked doors. The great machine had only ever reached for the guilty. It had not harmed the watchman who saw the hands turn, nor the washerwoman who heard it speak, nor the 100 souls Eli led up the tower stair. It had frightened them, yes, the way thunder frightens, but it had never once struck where there was no debt to collect. Justice that punishes the innocent along with the guilty is not justice at all, only another kind of cruelty. And whatever Abel Crane had become in his death, he had been a just man in his life, and he did not forget the difference. The boy had loved him and served him faithfully, and owed nothing on any ledger the clock could read. And so the clock let him be. But it was more than innocence that spared Eli. It was love, and a debt of the better kind, the only kind that does not have to be paid in suffering. In the last of it, when the guilty were gone and the town had crept back toward its ordinary days, the boy did the thing he had waited all those cold weeks to do. He saw to his master. The 11 dead girls were given honest stones at last. their names cut deep where Pike's money had once kept them blank. And Abel Crane was lifted gently from the iron heart of the clock he had built, and washed, and laid in a good plain coffin, and buried in the churchyard on the hill, in the sunlight, under the open sky he had so seldom left his workshop to see. It was Eli who chose the spot. It was Eli who stood longest at the grave when the others had gone, a thin, silent boy with his notebook in his pocket and his master's tools wrapped in cloth under his arm. The last of a family of two, he could not speak a eulogy. But the young minister, who had come at last to believe everything the boy had tried so long to tell him, spoke for him, and said that here lay a poor and honest man who had been given a terrible power and had used it, in the end, with mercy, sparing the guiltless and asking nothing for himself but the truth and a decent burial and the safety of the boy he loved. The mothers of the 11 came to that burial too, all of them, and stood with the boy at the graveside, for they understood that the old man had won them the justice that the law had sold, and that their daughters slept a little easier for what he had done. It was as good a thing as has ever been said over any grave, and it was true. And Eli, who had wept so often in the dark, found that at this graveside in the clean morning light, he did not weep at all, but only stood and remembered and was at peace. And on the morning Abel Crane was laid in the ground, the great clock of Ashford Mills, which had stood silent and frozen since the night of the last bell, did one final thing. The whole town heard it, and many came running to see. As the first earth fell on the old clockmaker's coffin, the 4 pale faces of the tower clock stopped for weeks at the hour that does not exist, gave a single soft shudder, and then, slowly, gently, with no hand to move them, the great hands turned. Not backward now, not wild. They came round once, smoothly, truly, the way Abel had set them to run 30 years before. And they stopped at the right and ordinary hour of the real and living morning. The clock had told one last correct time, the proper hour of its maker's burial. And then it stopped forever, at peace, its work complete. A machine that had been asked to do a terrible thing and had done it and was finished. It never ran again. No clockmaker who came after could make it keep time, though a few tried, and most who climbed that tower came down pale and would not go a second time. In the end, the town let it be. The hands stayed where they had stopped on the morning of the burial, pointing at an honest hour. And there they pointed still when the mill closed, and when the workers drifted away to other towns, and when the windows went dark one by one, and Ashford Mills began its long, slow surrender to the hills. As for the boy, he did not stay. There was nothing to keep him, and too much to remember. When his master was buried, and the dead girls had their stones, and the last of it was done, Eli wrapped Abel Crane's fine small tools in their oilcloth, and closed the little shop on the square, and walked out of Ashford Mills down the southbound road, a mute orphan of 16, with a trade in his hands and a whole life still before him. He did not look back at the tower. He did not need to. He carried the best of it with him, in his hands and in his heart, where no fire and no greed and no passing hour could ever reach it. And that, but for the telling, would be the end. Save that some stories refuse to stay buried, and this is one of them. They say the tower still stands, out in the hills where Ashford Mills used to be. The town is long gone now. The looms fell silent. The river runs clean again, and the forest has taken back the streets where the company houses stood. But the mill tower remains, its brick gone soft with ivy, and high upon it The four faces of the great clock still look out over the empty valley. Their hands stopped where they stopped on the morning an honest man was buried, pointing forever at a true and ordinary hour. Hunters and wanderers still come upon it sometimes, and they say that if you stand beneath it in the dusk, in the right and perfect silence, you can almost hear it, not ticking. The clock has kept no time for 100 years. Only faint and far and patient, a single word turning over and over in the cold. Time, time, time.
And here, if you will have it, is what that word has to teach.
The lesson is older than any clock, and it is this: there is no debt that does not come due. A man may lock a door against the people he has wronged, and buy the silence of the law, and run as far as the southbound road will carry him, and tell himself that what he has done is forgotten, or paid for, or beneath him. But the scales of this world are truer than the wicked ever believe. Every hour we take from another, every life we spend to fatten our own, is written down somewhere in a ledger no money can reach. And soon or late, in this life or at its very end, the account is settled in full. Evil begets evil, as surely as one turning gear drives the next. Cornelius Pike learned it too late, and paid it forever. That is the whole of the matter, and it is enough. But the tale leaves us one gentler truth beside the hard one, and we would do wrong to forget it. For in all that long, cold reckoning, there was one the darkness could not touch. A mute orphan boy who owned nothing in the world but a kind heart and a faithful one, walked out of that valley alive and whole. The clock that judged the guilty had no power over the innocent, and no quarrel with love. And so, when everything Pike had built had crumbled into ruin, the small and faithful thing the boy carried, his loyalty, his decency, the love between an old man and the child he raised, was the one thing in all that story that survived. The mighty fell, the gentle endured. It is always so in the end, though we so often forget it in the meantime. So if this story has kept you company tonight and sent a worthwhile chill down your spine, then do an old storyteller a kindness. Stay a moment with the boy and the old man, and with the lesson they paid so dearly to leave us. If the tale moved you, share it with someone who loves a good and haunting story, and tell them what the great clock told the whole valley, so that they might remember it too. Leave a thought below, if you will, on whether Cornelius Pike was given justice or something crueler still. And if you would hear more tales told in the dark, then follow along and keep your lamp lit, and let us meet again by this same quiet fire. Until then, wind your clocks and keep your hours honest, for time, as the old man said, remembers everything, and time always, always collects its debts. Sleep well and mind the bell.